Okay, right, cool. So, so I'm going to be talking about what was the USSR. Now, this is we are presented, I think, with two myths, and I'll present the first myth first, and then we'll move on to discuss the actual background to the revolution and what happened. We'll just quickly run through that. It won't take very long, but the background's quite important. However, I have to say, and then we'll have to spin through the myths created by the state of the USSR immediately afterwards, and then we'll move on to to uncover what I call the real history, which is the is what was actually going on, and which some of you may not be aware of. So, okay, so we're going to start here with the first image. Is very much, it used to get it on Western media a lot, the sort of red square parades of missiles and troops and stuff tanks going through the red square, and it was to give the idea that the Soviet Union was extremely militaristic, very aggressive, blah blah blah, and that it was a threat. It was a threat to Western society, and that they could somehow manage to outmatch the West in every conceivable manner, militarily speaking. Then next image, please. Next image. Hello. Oh, here we go. Right. So another of the stereotypes, of course, is the sort of box type housing, with everybody living in rabbit hutches and having a very dull and boring life, and being very miserable, and with only bottles of vodka to keep you sane, and well, there's a certain amount of truth to it. As with the previous image, there's a little bit of truth to that, but this one is rather ironic, because you'll find lots of housing estates in the West which are just like this. If any of you's ever grown up in a public housing estate in the West, then you get the same sort of box type apartments here too. Then we can move on to the third image of the Western myth, please, Francesco. Right. Yeah. So it's this idea of everybody's indoctrinated. This is a pioneer camp in, I think it's probably about 1950s or 60s possibly. A pioneer camp where everybody's wearing exactly the same clothes, and they all sing songs in praise of Lenin, and they're sort of militarized at the bottom. You see them in uniforms and so on and so forth, and everybody's completely indoctrinated, and they're all like robots. So that is the third image of the general Western myth, which was created in the media, living under absolute tyranny, and if you step out of line, you go to the gulag, and so on and so forth. Right, so we can now move out of that myth. We can go on to the next image. which is, I'm just going to give you a brief, next image, please. Yeah, okay. Unfortunately, it's a little bit small, but this is a, we're now going to talk about the background to what happened in 1917. Basically, this is a cartoon of what the various revolutionary groups, and there were several of them, they thought of the Tsarist state was. It was extremely backward in terms of Europe, because at that time, in the 19th century, most countries in Europe had gone through development into what we would call capitalist nation states. This didn't happen in Russia. Russia was very, very backward, and Austria-Hungary was sort of similar, but more advanced than Russia. Russia was overwhelmingly a peasant economy in the early part of the 20th century. Even then, whatever capitalist development was in the country was, and there was some quite heavy advanced industry, but it was generally financed by British or French capital. It was generally to do with the armaments, and it was only like something like, when the revolution took place, there was only about 5% of the population was actually industrial working class. The vast majority of the population were rural working class, you can argue, peasants, poor peasants, a lot of them. And so this pyramid gives you an idea of, it's based on an anarchist model, I think, which there's a similar anarchist cartoon-like thing of the layer cake of society, but this one is geared towards particularly Russia. So you've got the peasants at the bottom who are holding up the whole lot, the peasants and the workers, and then you've got the people who are eating and having the life of Riley, and then you've got the army and the bosses, and the aristocrats and the clergy, and right at the top is the Tsar. Now, the Tsar was a complete autocrat, and even there were attempts at reforms. In the 1860s, they had abolished serfdom, which is a big step forward for Russia. But there was a real resistance at quite a lot of levels to going forward and trying to emulate what the West had already gone through, and there were a number of reasons for that. The main one was that the Tsar and his minions were terrified that change would unleash a storm, which it did, of course. So their main reaction to it was to stamp it out by any means necessary. So they had a secret police force. They had you could be exiled, you could be thrown into Siberia, to prison camps. Dostoevsky gives an account of his life there. Something similar happened to the anarchist Bakunin. Hello? Yeah. So anyway, and there was a social democratic party, they were divided into two groups. You had the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. The Mensheviks were actually the majority, the Bolsheviks were the minority, and they didn't really disagree on very much. Basically, they took their ideas from the Second International. Now, the Second International was a sort of crudification of Marxian thought. So it was like to have these stages of development. It saw Marx's analysis of capital as having a universal thing, and that everybody went through certain stages. So they went from feudalism to capitalism, and then on to socialism. And they went on through socialism. Now, this is quite interesting as well, because it bears on what happens next, is in the German case, because it was the Germans who were dominating the Second International. Now, in order to increase Germany's, make Germany a competitive player in the capitalist game of imperialist powers, German state had to invest hugely in bringing forward its industrialization. So the state in Germany was heavily involved in the industrialization of Germany, and that made it a little bit different. But what the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, because they were both part of the Russian Social Democratic Party, argued was that it took you forward. It meant that you were on the verge. By involving the state, it meant that you were on the verge of capitalism moving into socialism. And this idea is quite central to what happens as we progress, because they all assumed that this was their theoretical background had made them make this assumption. Now, there was in 1905, after the Russian failure in the Russo-Japanese War, there was a revolution that broke out then. Now, interestingly, none of the Social Democrats had foreseen this, and they were quite surprised as the Tsar's lot, because what happened was that there were Soviets were set up. Now, Soviets were basically workers' councils, workers and peasants' councils. So they were set up to, if it was a countryside estate, they would take over the estate, or if it was a factory, they would take over the running of the factory and run it themselves as a democratic body. And people like Lenin were actually quite shocked by this, because they had imagined that it would take a disciplined party of professional revolutionaries who would have to lead everybody through the revolution. And this is an idea which they actually never let go of. But as I will show you, but this is quite crucial. But they were shocked by this. But then they thought, well, this is something we hadn't thought of, but we're going to have to integrate it into our theory. So in 1917, Russia had again entered the First World War. The First World War was falling apart for quite a lot of powers, not just Russia, but because Russia was the weakest player apart from maybe Ottoman Turkey, was the weakest player in the whole conflict. Russia started to collapse. once its war machine had run out of steam. And in 1917, in February 1917, a whole lot of workers came out onto the streets, and they demanded. It was actually on International Women's Day. It was mostly women. They demanded peace, bread, and land, and this was the start of a successful overthrow of the Tsar. So the Tsar was overthrown and was replaced by a provisional government led mainly by social liberals, or people who wanted to pretend they were social liberals anyway, but what was happening in the factories and in the estates, once the deserting soldiers were going back to their peasant farms, they presumably took their weapons with them, and they said to the landlord, well, we're taking over this and we're going to make it into a commune again. And now the commune, as I say, was a traditional Russian. This is a traditional Russian social form which had survived feudalism. It derived from primitive Slavic society. And no, can you move them back, please? Sorry, you're going forward too fast. Sorry about this. So in February, and from February onwards, throughout 1917, there was a dual power emerged where the Soviets were in power on one hand, but there was also this provisional government. The provisional government insisted on continuing with the war, and this is where, and the war was very unpopular by this point, and Lenin seized, who was the leader of the Bolsheviks, he seized on the idea of, right, we're going to overthrow this unstable provisional government, and we're going to make it a proletarian revolution. So he or the Bolshevik Party, which is this disciplined vanguard of the working class, as Lenin and his cohorts would have said, seized control of Petrograd, which was the capital. And right now, can we go back a couple of images there? Because I just wanted to talk. This is about the Bolshevik propaganda. So can we just go back one more? Yeah. Okay. Well. Yeah. Okay. Well. The Bolshevik propaganda is just as mythical as a Western one. This, it sort of. There was this really backward monarch with Nicholas II, right? And next picture. Yeah, and then everybody stormed the Winter Palace. This is from Eisenstein's film. This is a scene from Eisenstein's famous film October, which was made in early 1920s. And it created this mythical thing of masses of workers and peasants charging in and having to face heavy fire from the Winter Palace. Actually, the taking over the Winter Palace, which was quite a minor event, really, wasn't anything like that. It was pretty much a walkover. I don't think anybody got killed, in fact, on either side. So so this is all part of the Bolshevik myth, right? So next image, please. Yeah, and then everybody, and then the sort of next development of the Bolshevik thing is that once the revolution's over, then it's all we move forward, and Lenin is electrifying the country, and it's all going to be wonderful. We're all going to live in a socialist paradise. So that was with mechanization and production of goods and so on and so forth. All right, so that shows you how crude both these positions are. Okay, so if we can move on to the next image, then we can just have a look briefly at the scale of the USSR. Francesco, great, yeah. So this is the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The Russian part was only part of it. There were there's Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic. There was the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, and so on and so forth. There was a lot of them, and I mean it's a vast country that it was pretty much when the Bolsheviks took control, with the exception of the Baltic States, which had got its independence in the period of the Russian Revolution. By the time the dust had settled, and Finland had got its independence as well. The Soviet Union was pretty much the entire Russian Empire as it existed before, but without Finland and the Baltic States. Now the original plan, as far as Lenin was concerned, Lenin wanted a federation of socialist republics, and that would be more or less independent. Well, this is what he was. He was a fairly contradictory character, Lenin, shall we put it that way? But this is what he envisioned. Of course, he didn't enact what he envisioned, but certainly by the time you get to Stalin, all the decisions are made in Moscow for the whole of the Soviet Union, and it's this grand plan, and we give you your orders, and then you carry them out, to the local socialist republics and stuff. But basically, nobody has any say apart from what's going on in Moscow. Right. So that just gives you an idea of the scale and size of the Soviet Union. You can see that in the West is mainly where it's most industrialized, as far as industrialization is concerned. The most advanced parts, if you like, are in the West. The huge parts of Siberia are completely uninhabited, and then of course there are the Asian republics and the Caucasus as well. All right, I think we can probably move on to the next picture. Right. Okay. So what do you think this is? Well, this looks like it's either a load of people who are having a having their picture taken, which they are, but it looks as though it might be a something maybe run by the Bolsheviks. Well, it's not. Now this is quite interesting because not many people talk about this, but this is actually a picture of what was happening during the Russian Revolution, which is mainly going on as far as the Bolsheviks were concerned in Moscow and Leningrad, or Petrograd as it was known at the time. This is what was going on in the Ukraine. Now this was they called themselves the Magna Vista Insurgency, and it was basically a peasant revolution that that took over vast swathes of the Ukraine, and they considered themselves to be anarchists, and they turned all the land that they got into communes. And this was all spontaneously organized. There was nothing top down about it. It was all organized by rural proletarians, people who were very poor, and it was hugely successful. And in fact, what the Bolsheviks later hid, because they crushed these people here who were revolutionaries as well. The Bolsheviks later on crushed them, but in the early part of the Civil War, which is the white armies were marching on Moscow, and it's arguable that they would have got to Moscow if it hadn't been for these guys here, or guys and women, because the women there as well, who they were very, very effective fighters, and they tied down a huge amount of the White Army's military power, that prevented the whites from getting, arguably, from getting to Moscow. So as I say, and it wasn't just the Magna Vista insurgency in the Ukraine. There were also other groups a little bit like this springing up all over the what would become the Soviet Union, who were completely independent. And for instance, I mean, on a more social democratic level, there was alternative governments set up in the Baltic States, which we've already talked about, which did get independence for a while, and also in the Caucasus, in Georgia and Armenia, Azerbaijan, places like that there. Now, so that was on a more social democratic level. I think these people were quite determined to be revolutionaries. So they're the most revolutionary of these groups, but there were also social revolutionaries who were much more connected to the peasants, and independent peasant groups who were resisting whoever was going to try and boss them about, whether it's the whites coming saying, oh, we're going to tell you what to do, or whether it was the reds coming to requisition some grain to feed the cities. They said, well, get in your bite, you know, because we're in control here. Okay, we can have the next picture, I think. Yeah, now this is another image. This is from 1921. This is March 1921, in fact. And you would think, well, this is showing the Red Army resisting the imperialist powers which had invaded the country and the whites and blah blah blah. It's not. This is it is the Red Army. They are actually crossing over the frozen sea between Petrograd and the naval base of Kronstadt. Now, Kronstadt in 1921, the country had been under Lenin and his cohorts put everybody under what they called war communism, which was a really dictatorial system of forcing everybody to be virtually militarized in the factories, or if they didn't go to the army, you know, there was conscription, and then there was also requisition of the peasantry, quite brutal requisition of the peasantry, and a lot of it was simply because the Bolsheviks didn't understand peasants at all, because they were all city boys and girls, or else they were actually, a lot of them were from quite genteel classes themselves. I'm talking about the leaders. I'm not talking about the rank and file. But so this is the Soviet army attacking workers and mutinous sailors and soldiers on the island of Kronstadt, and they crushed that rebellion just as ruthlessly as they crushed everything else. But the Kronstadt rebellion was part of a wave of strikes which had nearly toppled Lenin's power, but he brought in Trotsky, and Trotsky was decided to deal with it in the most ruthless manner possible. Okay, so that's just two aspects of the hidden history, right? So now we move on. We're now in the what's known as the new economic policy, which is what Lenin brought in. Lenin was assuming increasingly dictatorial powers to get things done. Now, a lot of people get the idea that the Bolshevik Party was just everybody obeyed the top. It wasn't quite like that. There were quite strong oppositional groups within the Bolshevik Party right up until about 1921. There was the workers' opposition. There were all sorts of different groups, and by 1921, Lenin had decided he'd had enough of it, and he thought the only way of getting things forward was by assuming dictatorial powers of the chief executive. Now, this, of course, played into Stalin's hands, because Stalin was busy amassing all the bureaucratic power behind Lenin. Lenin didn't realize this until he was on his deathbed, and it's too late by then. But you know, Lenin has to take some of the blame. He was partly responsible. So this is showing, you know, this is the 1920s now. So this is after the new economic policy. After the new economic policy, it basically brings back capitalism. So it's or capitalism as it existed in that period of the Soviet Union. So it was it brought back the right of the peasants, or at least the rich peasants, to charge market prices for their produce. It also brought back a certain amount of private industry to the industries that were still left after the Bolsheviks had taken power. So so it was pretty much everything that there was a huge amount of privately owned land. I mean, it wasn't like and especially after they'd crushed all the other revolutionary groups, and then they decided to privatize everything. Now, this was starting to annoy the working classes, you can possibly imagine. But anyway, so this is just an idea of what it was like in some normal images of life in the USSR in the 1920s. So here we have a group of people playing chess, much as they would have done in the immediate preceding Tsarist period. Right, next picture. Now this one is it looks extremely bourgeois. You've got like people. It's a seaside town. It's possibly on the Crimea. It's a boardwalk cafe. Everybody. It looks almost. It wouldn't look out of place in 1920s Europe of the time. Yeah, so you have this sort of return to bourgeois normality, with the exception of there just being one party in power and running everything. So with the exception of that, it's pretty much back to normal bourgeois society. We have the next image. Francesco, next image, please. Yeah, so this is how normal it is. I mean, this could be like Dickensian London. This is what, this is how normal in terms of capitalist society 1920s Russia was. This is from 1924. There was a big famine, and there were lots of children sleeping on the streets of Moscow and Leningrad and various other cities. And this is a picture taken of them. So it's just like, it's no different to say what George Orwell was talking about in Down and Out in Paris and London. There isn't a huge amount of difference, is there? Right. Okay. So we can have the next one. Yeah. Right. So, and then along comes Mr. Stalin, who gets rid of Trotsky, and who's his main rival, but he also gets rid of or reduces the threat of other rivals like Zinoviev and Kamenev. Now, I should talk about here. I'll just talk a little bit about this part of it now. Now, this is the period of mass collectivization of the farms and the huge effort put into building up the industry of the Soviet Union, the heavy industrial base that Stalin and Lenin and Trotsky were all considered should be the development forward for the workers' state in scare quotes. So this is all derives from Preobrazhensky's theory of socialist primitive accumulation to the capture of the state. And this was a forerunner of Trotsky's later theory of the permanent revolution. Now, Brzezinski, he opposed a lower value, which is like the market and capitalist economics, to a law of planning, which he said was socialist economics. Okay, so this is quite essential, and it all derives, as I say, from the Second International, which we've been talking about earlier, which is this whole rigid idea that you go from here to there, and then you get to the final stage, which is socialism. Right. So this led on to Trotsky's concept of the USSR being a degenerated worker state. The centrality of planning, this is after he got kicked out, by the way. The centrality of planning meant that it was indeed socialist, of course, and any residual capitalist features, such as wages or commodities, were simply empty husks, devoid of their former meaning. So if they were devoid of their former meaning, then why were they hanging about? That is a good question, which Trotsky failed to answer, and Brzezinski as well. So this shows this picture here shows the peasants marching forward to their shining, happy future in the USSR, or not. It's a propaganda picture, of course. And then we can move on to the next one. Yeah. So this is what the collectivization was supposed to achieve. This is the is showing, you know, like the great big tractors and the mass factory like production of food for the cities and so on and so forth. And there's all supposed to be a wonderful step forward, and this is as Stalin was introducing these 5-year plans. He started in 1928. And this is so the first 5-year plan was 1928 to 1932, and this is what the propaganda, of course, showed the end result would be, and everything would be marvelous after that. And what the collectivization actually involved, it was like throwing a whole lot of peasants together, and then you basically you force them to move to work as a unit under government control, under the control of commissars and so on and so forth, and you take the surplus produce and sell it in the cities. The peasants were allowed to keep a very small plot of land for themselves, which they could sell the produce from that in the market as before. But the vast majority of their produce would be transported off and given to everybody in the factory, and the cities. Well, that was the theory. And then if we have a look, we can move on to have a look at a bit more what it was really like. Next picture. Yeah. So this gives you a sort of idea, you know, we're starting to look at the real reality of it. You know, a lot of Russia, it remained up until quite recently very backward, even after all the several 5-year plans and all the rest of it. So this is giving you an idea of the hardship that these bureaucratic plans from the center entailed. We can move on to the next picture now, which gets even harder. Yeah, so this is pretty shocking image here. Now this is during the famine. Now the 5-year plans had caused severe famines because now it's difficult to say, as with all bureaucratic operations, it's difficult to say where cruelty begins and where incompetence lays off. And certainly both were very much a feature of Stalin's Soviet Union. Anyway, this is showing some peasants who have starved to death because they haven't been able to get work. They have been forced to leave the communes because there isn't enough work for them on the communes, and they go into the cities. They can't find work there, and they starve to death. So next image. Yeah, and I mean, this is how casual it got. You know, I mean, this is a famous or infamous picture of somebody dying or dead on the street from hunger, and people just walking on by. I mean, it's not that different if you think about it to what is actually, you know, I mean, there's a lot of homeless people certainly in this country, and I'm sure there is in most of your countries who are watching, and you know, it's not that similar to what you get in here, but it gives you an idea that this isn't exactly a socialist paradise, is it? The you know, people are just literally dropping on the street. Okay, next picture. Yeah, so this shows the extent of the famine. Now, one interesting development, which I'll touch on here, is you can see where it was at its most prevalent. Now, in all these areas, there was heavy industrialization going on and heavy collectivization, and they coincide with the maps of where the famine hit hardest. So you can see Ukraine is hit very badly, a bit into Belarus. You can see that it also went across into the Don, and into the Caucasus itself. And in addition, there was another big patch in the East Asian republics as well, Kazakhstan, etc. And this was a consequence of the plans. But you've also got to take into account that Russia had been cut off from the West. The West wasn't interested in supporting the Soviet Union at all in any shape or form, weren't interested in giving them any industry or anything like this. So they had to do it all themselves. So you could make that argument for Stalin if you like. I don't think it holds up very well, but it is worth considering that part of the reason why the famine was so bad was that Stalin was selling off the grain to Western countries, and Western countries decided to buy the grain, even though they could get the grain cheaper elsewhere. Now, why were they doing that? Well, we don't know, but it sort of puts these things in perspective a bit. But I'll just mention quickly here that there's this thing in the Ukraine where they say that this particular period was a genocide against them, and you can see why they might think that, but it's not as simple as that, because in fact it's much more widespread than just the Ukraine, and in fact the heaviest casualties were in the Upper Caucasus. Anyway, right. So we move on to this one now. Now this is this just shows you how brutal and impersonal the Soviet Union was certainly under Stalin, and they were moving people around in cattle trucks or industrial coal trucks, a bit like this. These are prisoners being moved to Gulag in Siberia, and basically this is it's not well known, but there was actually quite a lot of resistance to Stalin's program in the Soviet Union, a lot more than you'd think. There was a big strike in the Ivanovno region in 1932, which was an industrial region which had been set up by Stalin, and the weavers in a town called Vichuga, they got really militant, and they're predominantly women as well. And the Soviet authorities were really scared, and all the repression that they threw against it didn't work, and the workers actually won quite considerable concessions from the state, because basically what was going on was what Marx would have called primitive accumulation. It was like it's the initial drive towards building up the capital that you need to properly develop capitalism, right? So it was like workers were being forced to work long hours, and they were forced to, they called it storming. They had to in order to reach the targets that the central state had set, they had to plow through all this, all the schedules, like, so they might be working like 24-hour shifts or something. There was very bad safety regulations, and there was also wage cuts and things like this here. So it's no wonder the workers were not happy about this, and the strikes, the wage strikes, were saying, they said to the Bolsheviks, or the Soviet authorities, as they were called by them, you're not following the revolution. This is not what we fought for. So, but of course, a lot of them were rounded up, especially if they're party members. Party members were particularly vulnerable if they said something wrong, or were thought to have said something wrong, or so on and so forth. If you were politically involved at any level, you were likely to end up in one of these coal trucks being shipped off to the Gulag. Now, let's have a look at what they were up to in the Gulag. Next picture. Next picture, please. Thanks. Right. So, I mean, this is the sort of absurd scenario, which a lot of the work in the Gulag was involved in. It was like breaking rocks. Maybe you might be building a city. I mean, there is an entire city that was built by slave labor in Siberia, where they built factories and so on and so forth. But I mean, this is sort of hard, backbreaking, grueling, and frankly absurd labor that a lot of people in the gulags were involved in, usually for projects which never came to anything. I mean, Stalin wanted a canal built, and for example, it never got completed. So, and we don't know how many thousands and tens of thousands of even people who died trying to build this thing, and it was all for nothing. And of course, you were also living in the ice cold conditions of Siberia, and this is how they were also starting to industrialize and expand development, if you want to call it that, into Siberia. Okay, so I think we can go on to the next one now. Yeah. So so this is what happened in 1941. Stalin had made a pact with Hitler, as we all know, in 1939. It took the Western powers by surprise. I'm not going to go into that in great detail, but because there's arguments to be made that basically Stalin had been trying to get an alliance with the Western powers to oppose Nazi Germany right from quite an early stage. Now, this isn't making Stalin out to be a great guy or anything. He was anything but it is worth pointing out that he was actually trying to make an alliance with them, but the Western powers were quite convinced, because they knew about the Lebensraum policy of the Nazis and so on and so forth, that the Nazis just wanted to expand an empire into what was the USSR, and Stalin thought he had last minute. He thought, well, if I just sign a pact with Hitler, I can save myself from being overrun. Of course, it didn't work out that way, because as soon as Hitler had dealt with the French and the British, he decided to invade the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was then subjected to imperial style conquest. So here we have a group of German soldiers marching past. I think they are Russian prisoners of war. Now, we know that, I mean, there's a terrible cost of this war. The estimate of the amount of people who died from the Nazi occupation from 1941 to 44 was roughly about 28 million. Now, some of those were soldiers, of course, who got killed at the front. A lot of them went to labor camps, Nazi labor camps this time, where they were worked to death, or just starved to death. And a lot of them died there, and the atrocities which the Germans committed, or Nazi army committed in in Russia was staggering. The whole plan was, of course, to use it as a settlement area for German for colonists from Germany, and yeah, and this gives you an idea of what was going on all the time. If you've ever seen the movie Come and See, I do recommend it. It's a Russian movie from 1980s. It illustrates what was going on in a manner that I don't think any other fiction film, to my mind, has ever done. There was an attempt to eradicate large sections of the population. Of course, if you were Jewish, you'd be wiped out straight away. But still, wide sections of civil society was wiped out. The estimate is roughly about I think it's a third of the population of Belarus disappeared during the Nazi occupation. Okay, but next picture. Yeah, but the Soviet Union is triumphant at the end. This is the classic picture of the red flag going up of the Reichstag in Berlin at the end of the war, the end of the Battle of Berlin, and so from this point onwards, the Soviet army has liberated, if you want to call it that. Well, it was at that stage. It certainly didn't become a liberation, but it was seen as being a liberation, unless you were in Germany, of course, where where Stalin had allowed he basically encouraged his soldiers to rape as revenge for what had happened in the Soviet Union, to rape German women en masse. But initially, the other countries occupied, they say Poland and so on and so forth, they had they were allowed to engage in representative elections and so on and so forth. There were different factions. There were nationalists, there were independent socialists, there were obviously Stalin-aligned socialists, if you want to call them that, and then there were right-wing groups and so on and so forth. So there was a bit of a sort of hiatus, but immediately after the Second World War, but that solidified into the Cold War by the end of the 40s. The multi-party states which had emerged were suppressed in favor of Soviet style communist parties that seized power through one illegitimate means or another. And of course, the Baltic States, the Baltic States had, they'd been independent right up until the very start of the war. Then they were briefly occupied by the Soviet army, and then the Germans went in there, and then the Soviet Union came back in, but the Soviet Union decided to hang on to it. It didn't manage to hang on to Finland because the Finnish army was quite a formidable foe, and the Russians couldn't be bothered re-invading Finland. Okay, so so we can move on maybe to the next picture. I should also mention, right, we've been talking about this primitive accumulation of capital, and it's particularly it's particularly tied to a certain point of capitalist or pre-capitalist development, and or like pre-industrial capitalist development. It sort of coincides with commodity capitalism or merchant capitalism, but under the Soviet Union, it was going to go through a different form, obviously. But this is what Marx had to say about it, because it's interesting to contrast, because so far we've been dealing with, you know, Trotsky and Preobrazhensky and Lenin and Stalin and all the rest of them, and they're all tied into this idea of the stages, and you've got to go through the stages, and once you've got state planning in there, then you're going to achieve socialism. Socialism's just around the corner. Well, this is what Marx has to say about it, which is sort of contradicts that, because he's talking about the difference between advanced industrial capitalism and the free market, and the emphasis on the free market and its former state under can we go back a couple, just a minute? And it's between the advanced industrial capitalism and its former state, which is typically under autocracy in Europe, believe it or not. So, which is ironic as well. But what Marx says, he says that it is otherwise during the historical genesis of capitalist production. The rising bourgeoisie needs the power of the state, i.e., not the market, and uses it to regulate wages, i.e., to force them into the limits suitable for making a profit, to lengthen the working day, and to keep the worker himself at his normal level of dependence. This is an essential aspect of so-called primitive accumulation. So, you know, arguably you can say, well, this is what Stalin and all the rest of them, Lenin and Trotsky, all included, this is what they were aiming at. Of course, they could call it socialist primitive accumulation, but I don't know what the difference between primitive accumulation through say chattel slavery in the Caribbean under capitalist production, and the primitive accumulation through, say, the collectivization and famines and the gulags and so on. It's exactly the same process, and it's equally reprehensible. Right. Anyway, this is after, we're now at after the end of the war, and the Soviet Union goes through a bit of a boom period. Not greatly boom, but it does start to, in the 40s, 50s. In the 50s, with under Khrushchev, the Stalin period is dispensed with. A lot of the severe nature of the Stalin regime is brought to an end around that point. They're not entirely, but this is a sort of an idea no, can we go back, please? back. Yeah, that's it. Right. Okay. So we're so this is the there were certain achievements made in terms of, you know, in terms of there had been some sort of parity in some respects had been achieved under with the West, and in fact, in some respects, it even excelled the West, which we'll come to in a minute. But this is just showing you that a lot of the industrialization had been achieved. You can question the processes which did that, of course, but it certainly had achieved the industrialization. But also stagnation. Now, this is quite important. Now, the stagnation, I would argue, was due to class, mainly due to class conflict, but and also to do with the incompetence, huge incompetence involved in the state planning, everything organized from the center. That had part of it, but part of it was also class conflict, because you see, if you the way things were in the Soviet Union at the time, if you stepped out of line and tried to organize independently in a factory and so on and so forth, you were likely to end up in the Gulag. This had been discovered early on in the first 5-year plan. The workers were becoming more and more depoliticized, atomized, and they were fighting back in their own way. So there was huge amount of waste involved in the Soviet industrial process, a phenomenal amount of waste, and workers took advantage of the fact that there was a full employment program, and so therefore they couldn't be fired. So they would take time off, and they'd bring in stalls into the factory that would sell newspapers and drinks and all sorts of things, and the way in which it was brought, there was like a whole lot of excuses which you could have for laying off work, like because the buses were not the buses to transport the workers were not timed to fit with the shifts, so the workers could say, well, I'm going to have to leave early off shift, because if I don't leave now, then I won't be able to get home. So you know, the management had to sort of concede in all this, and so what you got was a whole lot of small level deals being made between the management, who had their targets to meet, and the workers, who were demoralized and didn't really have felt that they weren't investing in the system. And after all, they didn't own the means of production. The state owned the means of production. So they didn't have anything invested in it. All they were trying to do was try to reduce the amount of bad or reduce the amount of work that they had to do, and to increase their own free time, which workers do everywhere. You know, I mean, it's part of class struggle. But it was very much a feature of the Soviet Union. Okay, we can have the next picture. Right, now here we have Yuri Gagarin, of course. Now this is quite an astonishing achievement of the Soviet Union. Was that they completely they made America look really stupid, because America had, or United States had emerged from the Second World War as the dominant world power, dominating the vast majority of the planet, certainly before the Chinese Revolution, and they felt that they could throw themselves about and that they were the best in the world. They'd taken over from the British, and then all of a sudden the Soviet Union puts men in space, and makes the United States look very backward in that department and silly. And this is what led to, of course, NASA's project to get a man on the moon and all the rest of it. But anyway, that's just gives you an idea that on some level the Soviet Union was making some sort of achievements, but of course all the other stuff which I've been talking about earlier, about the huge amount of waste and the contradiction in the workplace, those were all building up for later on. Okay, next picture. Yeah, so this is just ordinary life in the Soviet Union in the 1950s, I think. You know, and you know, it's just a picture to show that, you know, not that it's just a group of women chatting about probably quite normal topics, you know. So I mean, by the 1950s, you got a sort of semblance of normality. You know, it just goes to show that normal life is being lived. These are ordinary people. They're not monsters. They're not robots. You know, they're just ordinary people going about the same sort of activities that people in the West and everywhere else in the world get up to. Okay, next picture. And this is again, I mean, a group of women again in the countryside, just having a good time. Next picture. Next, yeah, that's it. So and here again, this is in a city, probably Moscow, or back one. Just finish off with that one. Back one. No. Back. Francesco, can you move back just one? Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah. Well, as I say, this is just like a normal scene, you know, like a couple in the street. This is probably 1960s or early 70s, you know, and it's pretty much like life everywhere in the world, apart from your bread queues and all the other strange features of the Soviet Union. But, you know, and the fact that you can't get very many commodities in the shops. But, you know, life is pretty much the same as everywhere else. Okay, next one. Next picture, please. That's it, right, okay. So this is the last day of the Soviet Union. This is or last evening of the Soviet Union. This is the last night that the red flag flew over the Kremlin. Now we're now into the 1990s. We've had the Brezhnev period, which is excessive stagnation. You have like, for instance, the AZLK, AZLK car factory in Moscow, where there was like breakdowns due to shortages of supplies and so on and so forth at different points. You know, it's just like this is supposed to be the big car factory of Moscow, and every day they were running out of something. They might be running out of gearboxes one day, they'd be running out of exhaust pipes the next, you know, and so on and so forth. Seats, it'd be like constant nightmare in terms of this centralized planning and all the rest of it. So and of course, with the sort of passive aggressive resistance by the workers who were not able to organize, but they obviously wanted to resist the capitalist tendencies of the regime, even though the regime was not admitting that it was a capitalist regime. It was trying to pretend through ideology. Now, ideology is different to theory. Theory is theory constantly needs to be renewed, and it constantly needs to be analyzed and updated and all the rest of it. Ideology is something which takes hold and which is very resistant or can't be changed at all. And this is what the politics of the Soviet Union had become. And so workers, as I say, atomized because of Stalin had played a great role in that. They weren't able to resist collectively, so or politically, so they had become depoliticized and engaged in a sort of passive aggressive war of attrition with the state. And this is the end result. So the Soviet Union collapses. Now, part of it, I have to say, is also to do with the West, because the West was engaged in an arms race with the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union really wasn't equipped to deal with this. It was still an underdeveloped power, despite the fact that it made some significant industrial advances. It was still an underdeveloped power. Plus, it had all these internal problems that I've just been speaking about, and yet it's been forced into this arms race with Western Europe, which had far more resources that it could devote to the project. So that also meant that that they basically bankrupted the Soviet Union in terms of its arms expenditure, because the state could no longer support it. And I mean, it just goes to show that even if a war had broken out between Soviet Union and the West, it would have been a pretty one-sided conflict, because with everything breaking down in the Soviet Union, you know, their tanks would have broken down, and their guns wouldn't be working, and their missile launchers would be firing at half cock, and so on and so forth. It would have been a pretty one-sided war, despite the numbers on the side of the, you know, in terms of manpower inside the Soviet Union. Right. Okay, we can move on to the next picture. Right, so along comes Boris Yeltsin, and Gorbachev leads on to Yeltsin and so on. And suddenly everybody's free and they can all have big parties and they can go to rock concerts and enjoy the wonders of capitalism. So next picture. Yeah, so this is yeah, enjoy capitalism. So you got Coca-Cola, you can go to McDonald's, etc., etc. If you can afford it. Next picture. And this is more like what's really going on. So so all the 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 absurdities of the former regime are suddenly exposed to the absurdities of Western neoliberalism, and this is the end result. So you have people begging on the streets. This is, I think it's just outside the Kremlin. Even this is in 1990s, probably mid 1990s. Okay, next picture. Yeah, so and people who formerly would have got pensions, like this woman here, presumably, maybe disabled. She's past her working years. She would have got a pension at least under the so-called communist period, but she would have at least got that. And here she is begging on the streets. Next picture. Yeah, and then the stagnation, of course, the Brezhnev period, that led to a lot of these buildings being that had been built for the workers were falling apart anyway. But of course, once the 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 regime has collapsed, then you have then you have a break. Everything is completely neglected, and there's no repairs being made. And this is just like some housing block that is just collapsed through neglect. Now, probably some of that neglect started during the Brezhnev period, or maybe even before. But it's but certainly at the end of the Soviet Union, the government is no longer gives a hoot. So next picture. And this is how people react. So there's a huge increase in alcoholism, and there's a vast number of deaths. In fact, there's a population shortage, especially in men, that develops in the 1990s, and it's pretty obvious where all those excess deaths are going, and this is a consequence of the atomized, demoralized working class people who have basically been thrown. They've already been demoralized by the state, by the Soviet state, and then they're thrown on the scrap heap. And this is what when neoliberalism comes along under Boris Yeltsin, and this is what happens. Okay, next picture. And this picture just sums it up to me. Welcome to capitalism. I mean, it's just like this family. One table's completely empty. The other one's got a range of different soft drinks on it. In the middle of this chaos, which would be funny if it wasn't so tragic and serious at the same time. But I mean, to my mind, this sums up what the transition to capitalism entailed, in terms of from furthermore trauma, as if the Soviet Union people hadn't already suffered enough. This adds to their trauma. Okay, and then the last picture, I think.
Out of the frying pan into the fire, all for ideology's sake.
Right. Now this is what you have now. You have now this is the main opposition. I think it's the old Communist Party, basically, who are still the main opposition in the Soviet Union. A lot of people in the West don't understand this. They think it's Navalny or something like this. Well, Navalny's not very big outside Moscow, and Navalny is a nationalist, just like Putin. Really, it's not a huge amount of difference, except that he's supposedly more anti-corruption than Putin is. But the actual opposition, in the strongest opposition in the whole of what's now the Russian Federation, is still the Communist Party. The Communist Party, of course, has now changed its name. It's no longer a Communist Party. It's something like the Democratic Socialist Party or something like this. But it is the main opposition. And of course, there's this nostalgia for an age that never existed. That's an ironic comment, but it gives you an idea. I mean, what people have been through. If the last picture, this is the reality of the vast majority of people in the Soviet Union's reintroduction to what Western, or introduction to Western style capitalism, and this. So it's no wonder that there's all this quite unwarranted, but understandable nostalgia for what people imagine. Younger people growing up today, or people who've got some sort of memory of what it was before, but not a. But the passage of time has made them put rose-tinted glasses on when they think back to what the USSR, as this guy's T-shirt says, actually entailed. Okay, so I think we've pretty much reached the end there.